The champagne flutes trembled on their silver trays. 200 guests watched in stunned silence, and I, still in my white gown, stood with a red handprint blooming across my cheek. My husband's hand had just struck me. The orchestra froze mid-note, the air heavy with disbelief. Behind him, his sister smiled, a quiet, satisfied smile that told me this wasn't a mistake. It was planned. He slapped me on our wedding day, and that was the moment everything I believed about love shattered. I could taste the copper in my mouth, feel my veil slipping. The crowd waited for me to cry, to run, to break. But I didn't. I looked straight at him and whispered, "Ask me what you think I did, Julian." Say it out loud. That single line stopped the world. My name is Evelyn Carter, 31 years old, an accountant, steady, measured, someone who believed in the logic of numbers and the goodness of love. After losing my mother, I'd spent years trying to rebuild myself. Then came Julian Hale, charming, gentle, the kind of man who made promises in whispers. He made me believe in safety again, until that day showed me how false safety can be. And the worst part? It wasn't only him. It was her too, his sister Vanessa. Together they turned my wedding into a weapon. If you've ever trusted someone so much that you missed the signs of betrayal, you'll understand why I'm telling this. Because what happened that day wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my awakening. The moment I stopped asking why they hurt me and started asking why I stayed. If stories of strength and truth move you, subscribe and stay with me. What happened after that slap will make you believe that even the worst day of your life can lead to something powerful. The truth didn't start in that garden. It began months earlier, at a funeral under gray skies when I first met Julian Hale and mistook pity for love. It began on the coldest afternoon of my life. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that seeps into your bones. I was standing outside a funeral home, clutching a wilted bouquet I couldn't bear to throw away. My mother had died of pancreatic cancer, and I felt like the world had gone silent with her. That's when I heard his voice. "You look like you could use this more than I can." A man stood there, tall, dark coat against the wind, holding out a silver flask. His name was Julian Hale. I almost refused. My mother had raised me to never take comfort from strangers, but something in his eyes stopped me. They were a pale gray-green, calm and sad, like he understood grief in a language I couldn't yet speak. We shared that flask without saying much. No comforting words, no empty promises, just silence, heavy and familiar. And in that strange, quiet moment, I thought I'd met someone who truly saw me. Julian started calling a week later. Then came flowers, dinners, late-night walks along the harbor where he'd talk about his business, his childhood, his dreams. He listened when I spoke about my mother, about debt, about struggling to keep my apartment after she passed. And when I tried to apologize for being too much, he'd smile and say, "Evelyn, you don't need to apologize for existing." I fell in love with that line, with him. He came from old money, real estate, a family name printed on downtown buildings, but he carried it lightly, or so I thought. He didn't brag, didn't flash it, and that made me believe he was different. I didn't realize then that humility for people like Julian could be another kind of mask. 6 months later, he took me to brunch to meet his sister, Vanessa. She was younger than him, but somehow seemed older, cold, polished, every hair in place. She looked at me as if I were something tracked in from the street. "So," she said, stirring her coffee, "you're the accountant." "Not Evelyn. Not nice to meet you. Just the accountant." Julian tried to smooth it over, but I could feel her measuring me, deciding I wasn't enough. Over the next months, she became the shadow in every part of our relationship. If I picked a wedding venue, Vanessa had a better one. If I ordered flowers, she'd call the florist herself to make adjustments. Julian said, "She's just protective," but sometimes I'd catch the two of them whispering, and when I'd ask what it was about, his smile would tighten. Nothing important, he'd say. It was a lie wrapped in comfort, and I wanted so badly to believe him. Then, one night, he surprised me. Took me back to that same parking lot where we first met. Only this time it was covered in fairy lights. A violinist played under the trees. And in the middle of it all, Julian knelt and said, "You made me believe in second chances. Will you marry me?" I said yes before he even finished the question. For the first time since my mother's death, I felt chosen, cherished, safe. Vanessa clapped politely, her smile so tight it could cut glass. "We'll be sisters now," she said, squeezing my hand. But her eyes didn't match her words. They never did. Looking back, I realized the danger wasn't in how much I loved Julian. It was in how much I trusted him not to become his family, because love can blind you to the truth. And mine was about to walk me straight into a carefully laid trap. 3 months before the wedding, I found out I was pregnant. It was early morning at the office. The world outside was still gray, the kind of quiet that feels fragile. I locked myself in the restroom, my hands shaking as I waited for the test to show its truth. 2 pink lines, clear as daylight. I pressed a hand to my stomach and whispered, "You're real." I wasn't scared, not yet. I thought Julian would be thrilled. We'd planned to start a family eventually, but maybe this was fate's way of saying love doesn't wait for perfect timing. That night I wrapped a tiny onesie in tissue paper. It said, "Worth the wait." I placed it in a small white box and tied it with a gold ribbon. I wanted to see the look on his face when he opened it. When I arrived at his apartment, the lights were dim. I heard voices, Julian's low and sharp and a woman's. My heart stopped, but it wasn't another woman's laugh. It was Vanessa. I froze in the hallway, the box still in my hand. "I'm telling you, Julian, this is a mistake," she said. "She loves me," he replied, his tone tight. "You don't know her like I do." "I know enough," Vanessa snapped. "I ran her credit history. She had a bankruptcy at 22. Student loans she's barely finished paying, credit card debt. Does that sound like someone who isn't using you?" My throat went dry. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Don't do this," Julian said quietly. "She's not like Mom?" Vanessa cut in, her voice turning venomous. "You remember what happened when Dad trusted the wrong woman. Half his fortune gone because she played him like a violin. You really think this Evelyn is any different?" There was a silence that lasted a lifetime, and then Julian whispered, "If she finds out I had her investigated, she'll leave." My knees almost gave out. I wanted to burst in, scream, demand answers, but I didn't. I just stood there, invisible, holding that little box, the one that was supposed to bring joy, and realizing it never would. Vanessa's voice softened. "You can still fix this. You don't have to marry her. I love her," he said, but his voice broke on the word love, like it no longer fit. I left before either of them noticed me. Walked down those marble stairs and into the night, feeling my chest collapse with every step. The box stayed in my purse, unopened, like a secret I no longer had the courage to share. The weeks that followed blurred together. Julian acted normal, too normal. He still kissed my forehead, still sent flowers, but there was something hollow behind his eyes, something rehearsed, and Vanessa, she was everywhere. She insisted on helping me choose centerpieces, offered to handle the seating chart, and smiled that perfect poisonous smile every time Julian looked away. Once she leaned in and said softly, "You should be grateful." "Not many people get to marry into our family." I smiled back just as softly. "You're right." I just hope I survive it. I didn't realize how close that was to the truth. The night before the wedding, Julian seemed distant. I asked if he was nervous, and he said, "Just tired." When I tried to reach for his hand, he pulled it away, not harshly, but as if touch itself had become complicated. I lay awake for hours that night, one hand over my stomach, wondering how something so small could already make me feel so protective, so afraid. The next morning, everything was a blur of ivory silk, perfume, and laughter that didn't sound real. Vanessa came into the bridal suite holding a small jewelry box. "Something borrowed," she said with a smile. Inside was a diamond bracelet. "It was our mother's." Her eyes held mine in the mirror. "You'll take good care of it, won't you?" I thanked her, but something in me hesitated. When she clasped it around my wrist, it felt heavy, not from gold, but from intention. The ceremony went perfectly. At least that's what the pictures would later show. Julian looked at me like he meant every word of his vows. We smiled for the guests, kissed for the cameras, walked hand in hand through clouds of rose petals. And then came the reception, the part no one would ever forget. I was talking with relatives when I saw Vanessa approach Julian near the fountain. She slipped a folded paper into his hand, whispered something, and watched his face turn to stone. He looked up. Our eyes met across the garden, and in that instant, everything inside him hardened, the love, the doubt, the fear. It all twisted into rage. He crossed the lawn. The crowd parted around him like waves, and before I could say a word, his hand came down across my face. The sound was sharp and final, like a door slamming shut on the life I thought we had. I didn't know it then, but that piece of paper Vanessa handed him, the one that turned my wedding into a battlefield, was filled with forged bank statements, fake evidence, a trap designed not just to ruin me, but to protect her own secret. Because while I was busy planning a wedding, Vanessa had been busy stealing, and when she realized I was close to uncovering it, she made sure I'd take the fall first. The garden went silent. Even the breeze stopped moving, as if the world itself couldn't believe what had just happened. I stood there, one hand on my burning cheek, my veil half torn, and my new husband glaring at me as if I were a stranger who'd ruined his life. "Is it true?" he hissed, his voice low and sharp. "Did you steal from me?" At first I thought I'd misheard. The pain still rang in my head like a bell. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. He didn't answer. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket and held it up. "Don't lie to me. Vanessa showed me everything. The bank transfers, the signatures, the offshore account with your name on it." The crowd gasped. Someone's champagne glass slipped and shattered against the stone. I stared at the paper, at the yellow highlighted lines that supposedly proved my guilt. Fake accounts, false numbers, my name typed neatly beside figures I'd never seen. It was perfect. Too perfect. Vanessa stepped forward, her face painted with sympathy. "Julian, maybe we shouldn't do this here." "No," I cut in, my voice steady. "Let's do it right here. Let everyone hear the truth." A murmur ran through the guests. Phones came out. I took a deep breath, straightened my spine, and looked at the man I once trusted more than anyone. "Show me the papers." Julian hesitated, but I held his gaze until he handed them over. I scanned each page, every line, every figure. Whoever forged them knew what they were doing, but they didn't know me. "These are fake," I said quietly. He barked a bitter laugh. "Of course you'd say that." I looked up at him. "Then let's prove it." I reached for my phone in my clutch and unlocked the folder I'd been building for months. Copies of real ledgers, invoices, payment trails. "I'm an accountant, Julian. I handle numbers for a living. And I've been reviewing your company's financial records for half a year because I wanted to help you merge our finances after the wedding. But what I found," I turned to face the crowd, my voice clear and cutting through the air, "was a series of suspicious transfers, payments to shell companies, invoices for work that never happened, and transactions all traced back to one law firm." I paused, then I looked straight at Vanessa. "Your boyfriend's law firm." Her smile cracked. "That's absurd," she snapped. "Why would I ever steal from my own family?" "Because your father cut you off 2 years ago after you gambled away your trust fund, because you're drowning in debt. And because you're terrified your brother will find out you've been bleeding his company dry." A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd. Julian's face went pale. "Evelyn, stop." But I didn't. "You wanted to protect your secret, Vanessa. That's why you planted this lie, to make me look guilty before I could expose you. You used me as your shield." Vanessa's eyes flashed with fury. "You have no proof." "Oh, but I do." I turned my phone toward the screen where rows of numbers gleamed under the sun. Same routing numbers. Same fake vendors. The money trails lead to one place, your private account in the Caymans. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Some guests backed away. Others began filming. Vanessa's composure finally shattered. "You stupid little—" she spat, but Julian grabbed her wrist. "Tell me it's not true," he said, his voice shaking. "Please tell me she's lying." Her silence was answer enough. Then something inside her broke. The cold elegance vanished. "You never loved her," she shouted, turning on him. "You were looking for an excuse to hate her. I just gave you one." Julian staggered back as if she'd hit him. "Vanessa, you had her investigated, remember?" she sneered. "You didn't trust her from the start. I didn't make you slap her. You chose to believe I was right about her." The guests gasped again. My knees trembled, but I refused to fall. "You hired a private investigator?" I asked quietly. Julian's eyes glistened with shame. "I just needed to be sure that I wasn't a con artist," I said bitterly. "Sure that the woman carrying your child wasn't good enough for your family." He froze. The world seemed to tilt when I said it. "Yes, Julian," I continued, voice trembling but firm. "I'm pregnant. 8 weeks. I wanted to tell you tonight. But now?" I pulled the small white box from my purse, the one with the golden ribbon, and threw it at his feet. "Congratulations. You'll be a father. To a woman you don't trust." A collective gasp swept the garden. Someone sobbed. Others whispered. Cameras clicked like gunfire. Julian's face turned gray. "You're pregnant?" I nodded. "And I'd rather raise this child alone than let her grow up watching her father believe lies over love." I turned to the stunned guests, my voice carrying through the garden. "I'm sorry you had to witness this. But maybe it's for the best. Now you'll all know what the Hale family really looks like behind closed doors. Money, power, and rot beneath the gold." Then I turned, lifted my train off the grass and walked away, past the cameras, the whispers, the ruined champagne glasses. Behind me, chaos erupted. Vanessa shouting, Julian pleading, his father demanding answers. But I didn't look back. The slap that was meant to destroy me had just freed me. And I promised myself one thing. I would make sure the truth didn't just ruin them. It would end them. By the time I reached the gates of the Hale estate, the sound of shouting had faded behind me. My cheeks still burned, but inside me, something colder had settled. A strange, clean kind of calm. I didn't cry. I didn't even look back. That slap had broken more than the illusion of love. It had broken my silence. By midnight, videos of the wedding had flooded social media. The clip of Julian's hand meeting my face spread faster than wildfire. "The slapped bride," headlines called me. "Bride exposes millionaire family at wedding." Everyone had an opinion. Some pitied me, others called me brave, and a few whispered that maybe I deserved it. But I didn't read the comments. I was busy calling a lawyer. Within a week, divorce papers arrived, sent through Julian's attorney, with a settlement offer that could have bought my silence. I refused. Instead, I filed my own suit, for emotional damages, assault, and defamation. And I handed over every piece of financial evidence I'd collected, the same files that exposed Vanessa's embezzlement. What followed was chaos, police raids, frozen accounts, federal agents at the Hale offices. The story was everywhere. Hale family under federal investigation, bride's accusation proven true. I watched it all from my small apartment, wrapped in a blanket, one hand resting on my growing belly. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, not yet. It was disbelief. For years, I'd believed I wasn't strong enough to fight back. Now, the world was fighting on my behalf. 3 months later, the investigation was complete. Vanessa was charged with fraud, money laundering, and falsifying records. Her boyfriend, the lawyer who'd helped her, was arrested too. Julian's company nearly collapsed. Investors fled. His father had a heart attack and resigned in disgrace. When the court summoned me to testify, I walked in wearing a simple navy suit. No makeup, no jewelry, just the truth. Vanessa avoided my eyes. Julian didn't. He looked older, defeated, his once perfect posture slumped beneath guilt. When my testimony ended, the judge turned to him. "Mr. Hale," she said, "you struck your wife in public while she was pregnant. You'll pay for it, in more ways than one." Her tone was colder than the gavel that followed. Julian's lawyer requested supervised visitation when our daughter was born. I didn't object. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. Grace was born in early spring, a tiny, fierce miracle with her father's gray-green eyes and my mother's chin. The nurse placed her in my arms, and for the first time in years, I cried. Not from pain, not from anger, but from the overwhelming sense that I'd survived something meant to destroy me. I named her Grace, because that's what it took to forgive myself for loving the wrong man. Julian tried to visit a few months later. He brought flowers, spoke softly, apologized 100 times, but I kept our meetings short. The court had ruled, supervised visits only, pending completion of therapy and anger management. He didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes wet, and whispered, "You deserved better." I know that now, maybe he meant it. But I had stopped waiting for his truth. Over the next year, I built something new. With the settlement money and my savings, I opened a small accounting firm, specializing in forensic audits. Women started finding me, wives, partners, employees, all of them trapped by financial deceit. And every time I uncovered a hidden account, every time I proved a woman wasn't crazy for suspecting betrayal, I felt that quiet fire inside me grow stronger. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was purpose. One morning, nearly 2 years after that wedding, I received a letter. It was from Julian. His handwriting was shakier than I remembered. "Vanessa was sentenced today. 15 years. I wanted you to hear it from me, not the news. I'm sorry for everything, for believing her, for striking you, for letting fear win. You were right about everything, Evelyn. You didn't destroy me, I destroyed myself." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Grace was learning to walk that week, taking her first unsteady steps across the living room floor. And I realized something simple and profound. Every step she took was one I'd taken before her, shaky, uncertain, but forward. The slap had once echoed in my head like a curse. Now it was just a memory, the sound of an old life collapsing so a new one could begin. I didn't need Julian's apology. I didn't need the world's sympathy. All I needed was the life I was building. One honest number, one steady breath, one small step at a time. Years passed. The chaos faded, but the echoes of that day never truly disappeared. Sometimes, late at night, I would still hear the orchestra stopping mid-note, that instant when my whole life paused between humiliation and freedom. Then one morning, 3 years later, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Julian stood there, older, quieter, carrying an envelope. His eyes were softer now, lined with regret. "She's gone," he said. "Vanessa, cancer." It was fast. I felt nothing at first, not anger, not pity, just a strange kind of silence. He held out the envelope. "She left something for you." For Grace inside was a trust document. $2 million set aside in my daughter's name. A note was attached in Vanessa's handwriting. So she'll never have to marry for security. So she'll never have to wonder if she's worthy of love without conditions. So she can be what I never was. Free. For a long time I couldn't move. That money didn't erase what she'd done, But it meant one thing. Somewhere inside her, guilt had turned into grace. Julian looked at me and said, "I'm in therapy now. Real therapy. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just for you to know I'm trying." I nodded. "That's all you can do, Julian." "Try." He turned to leave, and I watched him go. The man who once broke me, now just another face in my past. That night, I tucked Grace into bed. She was 5 then, bright, curious, full of life. She looked up at me and said, "Mama, were you scared when Daddy hurt you?" I thought for a long time before answering. "Yes," I said softly, "but I was more scared of what would happen if I stayed." She nodded, as if understanding something much larger than her years. Then she pointed to the blocks on her bedside table.